Certainly today I am here as a SHRM representative. I am currently on the board. I am responsible for the monthly educational programs that SHRM offers. I really want to hear from you. If you don't want to talk to me about the programs that maybe you're interested in, or maybe we're not connected, please feel free to reach out to John McDowell, Frank Ingram, anybody else who is a part of our association. We truly are a family, and we want to hear from you, the members, because it's important to know what you think is important, what you need to do the job that you are doing every day. And it's certainly been a challenging year. It's been a challenging 18 months. So again, I want to make sure that you get the programs that your organization needs. Secondly, I am certainly here as a vendor. Most of you know me as Diane Campanelli from the Lions Companies. I enjoy a positive, terrific relationship with the Lions Companies. It is ongoing. They are now my client. So I started my own agency, once again, my own human resources consulting agency. My background is Westchester University, the Wharton School of Business, currently at Tulane Law School. I continue to add to my credentials because the hope is I provide you with what you need in human resources. I will have a flyer sent to you after today. Not comfortable going through it so much today. Most of you know me. Going back to our programming. So next year, pretty excited, Emma. I'm also going to have the EEOC commissioner in person. So we're looking forward to that. Because of our interest in compliance, I am so excited to introduce Monée Pressley. Monée and I had an opportunity to go over her presentation. It is exciting. It is interesting. Please feel free to go ahead and ask questions. Emma, if there are questions throughout today's presentation, shall they put it in the chat box, the question box? Would you be able to provide some information on that?
Yeah, either or. Whatever you prefer. The chat is fine. That way everyone sees it too. And we will get those answered for you.
Terrific. Monée, I hope you are ready, because I know there are a lot of people out here ready to hear what you have to say about RCSA, RSC. So please fill us in.
Thank you very much, Diane. I am excited to be here, everyone. As Diane has stated, we have been LinkedIn connections for a while now. And so we've communicated via LinkedIn. We now communicate via email and now via telephone. And when Diane presented this opportunity to present this exciting subject to you all a few months ago, I was very excited to compile the information based on my experience, the knowledge I have in this specific area. And I'm just excited in general to present to this diverse and varied audience. I know from speaking with Diane that there are a variety of companies represented, different sectors. So we have financial institutions, we have manufacturing firms, we have some nonprofits, but in general, we're all HR professionals performing the work to support company objectives and to be a support and a resources to our fellow employees. So this leads us to today's topic, the RCSA. I do just want to start by saying, acknowledging today is Veterans Day. So I want to start by thanking all of our veterans, any veterans who are on the call, any veterans, your family members who are veterans, or even your colleagues who are veterans. Today is a great day to acknowledge the service that these individuals, men and women, have performed over the years. So here's a little bit about me. I know my general bio was provided in the promo for this webinar, but I feel like I need to provide my background so you can understand the experience that I bring and the diverse experience I bring. So I started my career 14 years in higher education. I worked at a variety of institutions of higher education in the Delaware Valley, including Temple University, Drexel University, and the University of Pennsylvania. While at Temple University, I earned my Master of Education in Education Administration, because at the time, I just assumed I would end my career being a college administrator. I worked in a variety of administrative offices, sponsored research offices, student centers, until I landed at University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Human Resources, where I discovered my love and appreciation for human resources. So since that time, I've been in human resources for 13 years, with 9 of those years specifically focusing on HR risk and compliance. So a few years ago, I can honestly tell you, hardly anyone had ever heard of HR risk and compliance. What is HR risk? What is compliance? Or sure, we comply with the law. Sure, we comply with regulatory obligations because we're HR, that's what we do. And so HR risk and compliance was kind of built into the benefits function, talent acquisition, payroll, just by the nature of their regular everyday work and processes. However, there was never a carve out to focus on, to have a practitioner prioritize HR risk and compliance. So I'm going to walk through in this presentation the learning objectives, the overview and the purpose of a true and effective HR risk and compliance program, some key terms so that we're all speaking the same language, the actual RCSA, issue management, testing plans, and then finally a live walkthrough, just a scaled down walkthrough, not a hours long, which is what it really would take, but a scaled down RCSA walkthrough. So learning objectives. Once we complete this session, hopefully you will be able to analyze, or at least begin to analyze operational risks to identify and make recommendations for process or control changes, develop testing plans, and remediate, identify, and monitor issues that you find in your HR processes and control gaps. So what is a true HR risk and compliance program? A general overview is that it's an effective HR risk and program is a partnership of accountability. And I say partnership because it's not just one person. As I mentioned, we have benefits, we have recruiting, we have HRIS. Many HRs include payroll, employee relations, compensation. So it's a true partnership. It's not just one person saying, this is the HR risk and compliance specialist or director or whomever, whatever their title is, it's their responsibility. No, risk and compliance in HR is all of our responsibilities. So the partnership of accountability, meaning you own this risk, we all own this risk in HR. We execute those risks. Why do we own a risk? And why is there risk to begin with? Because we have typically because there are external regulations. And also to reliably meet company objectives. What is the purpose of an HR risk and compliance program? It's just that, to enable the company to address these multiple factors that are essential in managing and controlling risk. I want to highlight the last sentence in the purpose. It truly is to create a future state that is more effective, more efficient, and able to address modern challenges. So when you have an effective HR risk and compliance program, you are always striving to be more effective and more efficient in your processes, effective in your programs. Key terms. So I want to start and lay the foundation for the terminology I'll be using throughout the presentation so that we're clear on what these terms mean. I recognize that you will not remember every word and every definition as I work through the presentation. But hopefully, as I continuously use the terms, you will become more familiar and it will be like you've known these terms your whole life. The first term is regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance is a set of guidelines that an organization is required to follow in accordance with the law. So what does that look like at your organization? Now, the companies represented on this webinar, companies are located in various states, various cities, but in general, or actually 100%, we're all located in the United States. So we must all, in general, comply with certain federal regulations. And some of these regulations, they have a minimum employee count. So like if you have less than 50 employees, maybe you don't have to comply, or less than 500 employees, maybe you don't have to comply. But I just wanted to provide some general federal regulations that all companies must comply with. USERA, FMLA, FLSA, SOX, OSHA, ADA. These terms should be familiar to all of us as HR professionals. So again, regulatory compliance is how we go about complying with specific regulations. Operational risk, the second key term. Operational risk is the prospect. It is the risk, the potential, the likelihood of failed procedures, failed systems, failed policies. It's the loss that results from those failed procedures, systems, and policies. Some operational risk relates to human error. If you have human beings working in your company, there is operational risk. We are all human, we make mistakes. System failures, employee conduct. Some of this could be intentional, some employee conduct, misconduct can be unintentional. Cybersecurity event. So there used to be data breaches. It's a big topic now, or has been for the past few years. And a very real and present external event, pandemics, earthquakes, any event that disrupts business processes, operational risk. Related to operational risk, once you identify the risk, and we'll talk about this later, is creating a risk statement. So when you recognize what the operational risk is, you then create the risk statement, which should include a description of the threat or the source of the risk, the event, and the impact. As it relates to regulatory compliance, our first term, operational risk is introduced in your organization and how you operationalize the compliance. For example, all of our employers are required to provide a W-2 for all employees on an annual basis. The W-2 has timing requirements, has requirements for the content and information that's included on the W-2. So for operational risk, how are you going to go about creating the W-2? Validating and ensuring that the content on the W-2 is correct and complies with the law. And most importantly, how are you going to ensure that you have generated W-2s for all employees and terminated employees by the deadline? This is your operational risk exposure. The next term is internal controls. Some of you may not be familiar with the term, but you are definitely familiar with, if you work in HR, carrying out internal controls. Internal controls are basically actions intended to reduce the likelihood and impact of a risk. It's basically, I don't want to use the term fail-safe, but it's a mechanism put in place to either prevent, detect, or correct the risk or any risk event. So there are more than 3 types, but these are the 3 main types of internal controls: preventative, detective, and corrective. So preventative controls are just what they sound like. These controls are aimed at decreasing the chances of errors and fraud before they occur. Detective controls are designed to find errors and problems after the event has occurred. Corrective controls reduce consequences and/or rectify a failure after it has been discovered. Some of the examples for all 3: segregation of duties. So for those payroll people or people who work in compensation, anything in general, basically related to finance and accounting, should be familiar with segregation of duties. That's an internal control. Access control, user authentication, approvals, audits, crisis management, insurance, etc. So bringing it home to your house, internal controls, this is the easiest way to remember what internal controls are. So the lock on your front door is a preventative control. It prevents or attempts to prevent and stop unauthorized people from entering your home. The alarm or security system is a detective control. It sounds the alarm and detects and identifies that a problem has occurred, meaning someone has entered your home. Homeowners insurance is a corrective control. It provides funds to recover from a loss of the item stolen potentially by anyone who entered your home unauthorized. So we have the lock is preventative control. The alarm or security system is the detective control. And homeowners insurance, corrective control. And that should become more clear. I'll use the term internal control dozens of times over the next 40 minutes. So now we'll get into the RCSA. So we have our key terms: regulatory compliance, operational risk, internal controls. So the RCSA is the risk and controls self-assessment. It's exactly what it sounds like. But before I get to what it is and the benefits, I'll ask the question, why RCSA? And some of you are probably asking, why should I do an RCSA? It's because they're so much fun and they only take 5 minutes. If you couldn't tell, I was being sarcastic. They are time consuming when you first complete an RCSA. But as you get into a regular cadence, either quarterly, most organizations perform RCSAs on an annual basis, it'll get easier and it'll be like second nature to you going through the entire process. But starting and laying a foundation, I'm going to be honest, it is time intense. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of input and partnership. But once it is established at your organization, it'll become BAU, just like any other process that you perform on a regular and recurring basis within HR. So I would like to say that we should conduct annual RCSAs because it's good practice. It's just nice to do. It's a great thing. But I know that's not enough. So I want to highlight the dangers and potential dangers of not having an RCSA in place, and related to that, an effective HR risk and compliance program. Now, no one should raise their hand or take themselves off mute, but I'm sure you've heard many stories, or maybe it even has impacted or occurred at your organization. But why RCSA? Payroll errors causing $150,000 in overpayment to a terminated employee. Failures in Form I-9 compliance lead to $1 million in fines. Disability discrimination. The lawsuit cost the company $280,000. Employee theft. And these stats are very eye-opening. Third bullet, I really want to focus on that one. Organizations lose $1.5 million on average per fraud case. 29% of employee theft cases lasted more than 5 years. The employer had no idea, or they have no idea that this fraud is occurring. On average, 5 years, fraud is occurring. And the last bullet, 68% of all employee theft cases come from organizations with fewer than 500 employees. So that's why I mentioned my background, organizations I've come from. So I've worked at organizations where there have been 1,500 employees, 1,700 employees, 22,000 employees, to currently working at JPMorgan Chase, where we have over 260,000 employees worldwide. So you can't just think, oh, I don't need an RCSA, or I don't need internal controls, or I don't need to focus on risk assessments or self-assessments, because we only have 100 employees. We only have 499 employees. We only have 500 employees. But 68% of those employee theft cases, and that's just one risk, come from organizations with fewer than 500 employees. And the last bullet, and I went out of order on purpose. The last bullet I want to focus on is the second one. 33% of all business bankruptcies in the US are a result of employee theft. So you can read into that these are typically smaller organizations in terms of revenue, et cetera. But then again, if it's a huge, big enough fraud case or theft, it could bring down any organization. But 33% of all US business bankruptcies are a result of employee theft. And finally, why should you conduct an RCSA? Because you'll sleep better at night. You won't be awake at night thinking about, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if this happens? Now, you can't fully mitigate and eliminate all risks 100% of the time. However, the RCSA is a good practice to put in place to ensure that you have at least assessed and there's a reasonable comfort level that you are managing that operational risk. So risk and control self-assessment, RCSA. It is truly just a method of assessing inherent risk, then assessing your internal controls to support your processes, And finally, assessing the effectiveness of those controls. I'll go into more detail with those steps in the next slide. So basically we're at processes and controls. What is the inherent risk? What is the effectiveness of the controls? And then we'll get to residual risk. Second, a RCSA, it just proactively assesses the risk and controls in anticipation of reviews. We always want to be audit ready. And I don't know how many of your organizations have actual internal audit departments, or if your audits are conducted mainly by external organizations, vendors or consultants, KPMG, Deloitte, whomever. But whether you have an internal audit department or all of your audits are conducted by external organizations, the RCSA is a good tool to use to ensure that you are ready and that you are, I won't say pass, but you successfully or satisfactorily complete an internal audit. And finally, RCSAs help you proactively report and remediate self-identified risk issues. You don't know what you don't know unless you start digging in, assessing, reviewing, testing, etc. You really don't know. So as I said, there are 4 main steps. RCSAs that I'm presenting today, this is not a one-size-fits-all. If you were to go online or go to multiple organizations, you would find that this organization A conducts the RCSA this way, organization B conducts it a totally different way. That's fine. We understand that. But the content I'm providing today is a generalization and provides the best practice and the best steps and content and all the components that make up an effective RCSA. So there are 4 main steps. First, you start with assembling your risk inventory. Your risk inventory is comprised of your business risk, your business processes, and your internal controls. Second, you'll assess the inherent risk. Third, assessing the effectiveness of the controls. And fourth, determining your residual risk. Step 1, reviewing or creating from scratch your risk inventory. So what does this look like? Identifying your process. Now, if you can picture in your minds, we have HR processes, we have risks that are associated with performing those processes, and then we have internal controls to help mitigate the risk. So again, we have processes, we have risks, and we have controls. So when you identify your processes, I'll just throw some out there. We have payroll process, background checks, performance management, onboarding, hiring, offboarding, leaves of absence. These are, and you could call it, they may go by a different name at your organization, that's fine. But we generally get the gist of, these are in general the HR processes at every HR organization. We identify risks. So now that we have identified that we have a payroll process, a background check process, accommodations process, what are the risks affiliated with performing those processes? Negligent hiring. That's a huge risk. Misconduct, inadequate staffing levels, privacy breaches, employee theft, or key person risk. And I actually want to highlight key person risk. Many people may not think this is a huge risk or may not focus on it, but I would recommend for those of you who will walk away from this session today, hopefully all of you, and implement RCSAs, that you actually address key person risk. I have found this a lot in organizations where you may not think it and know it until it's too late. So a lot of people think key person risk just mainly means, oh, you mean the CEO of the company, or you mean the president of the company, or you mean this person. So we have a succession plan in place where the SVP then goes this way, or the chairman of the board. People think in those terms of key person risk. But what about your departments, including HR? What about your departments around your company where that person, Diane, Emma, Monée, they are, when they're on leave, when they take 2 days off work, this is a good way to identify your key person. or key people. If someone takes 2 days off work, whether it's planned or unplanned, and everything completely shuts down because that person is out, or you need to call, I won't say need because it's not, you don't necessarily need to call them, but if you must absolutely email them, text them while they're on 1 day of vacation or even 3 days out, that may indicate you have a key person risk. Why can't your organization or department or the process run without this person? Our RCSA will help address that. And then we create the risk statement once we identify the risk. So it's not enough, well, actually I will say, again, RCSAs are implemented differently at different organizations. The way I like to implement them is to also use a risk statement. Some people don't, they just identify the risk. It'll just be under misconduct, negligent hiring, key person risk. But the reason why I like using a risk statement is it helps capture the key components. What is the event? What is the consequence or the impact? And what was the cause? So some examples include failure to conduct background checks because of inadequate processes leading to employee theft that causes financial loss or regulatory scrutiny or legal liability. The risk of terminated employees continuing to receive pay due to managers not initiating the termination process and resulting in financial loss. And then finally, for step 1, we have identify and document internal controls. Step 2, now that we have our risk inventory, so we know our processes, we know the risk affiliated with those processes, and we've identified the internal controls we have in place or the lack of internal controls we have in place. Step 2 is you determine an inherent risk. Basically, inherent risk is the likelihood of a risk event occurring and the impact of that risk event occurring for all identified operational risks without internal controls. So this is the risk inherent in that process. So going back to the example of internal controls at your house, we talked about the lock on the door being preventative. The alarm or security system is detective. The homeowner's insurance is corrective. If none of those controls were in place, that's how you evaluate or assess inherent risk. So if you went to sleep at night or didn't go to sleep at night, let's say you left for the day and your door was closed, but there was no lock, there was no alarm system, there's no anything. And you also don't even have homeowner's insurance. So all that inherent risk that introduced, so we're in terms of that scenario, we're talking about someone could easily get into your house, just open the door, it's unlocked. You will not be notified. You won't even know someone's entered your house. And furthermore, if you don't even have homeowner's insurance or any type of coverage, then whatever is stolen, damaged, or whatever, or I'll even use an example of a fire. How are you going to rebuild? How are you going to recover from that loss that occurred because you did not have internal controls in place? So I hope that gave you a good picture of how we determine inherent risk. We think about the risk in a process with no controls whatsoever. And considering the inherent risk, we think about the likelihood and the impact. So the likelihood is what it sounds like. It basically reflects the probability that the event will occur. And I use over a specific period of time because, as I said, RCSAs should not be a set it and forget it process. You put the document or you save the document and put it on the shelf and you never think of it again. RCSAs should be living, breathing, I don't want to keep saying document, but documents or processes. This is something that should permeate throughout your everyday work within HR. You should always refer to it, and the actions you take and the processes should reflect the work that you perform completing the RCSA. So again, I have over a specific period of time because ideally you will perform the RCSA at least annually. So the next 12 months. So when you're determining inherent risk, when you're thinking about the likelihood of this risk event occurring, think about it over the next 12 months. So the rating scale in general for likelihood would be unlikely, likely, certain, imminent. And that's based on volume, scale, nature of activity, change, history of problems related to that risk. And then the second component of determining inherent risk is impact. It basically reflects the severity of the risk event. Some risk events, if it occurred, if it happened, it wouldn't be the biggest deal in the world. It just happens. It's everyday life. It's what happens in HR. Let's say we didn't conduct the background check until a day after the person was hired. Now, depending on your organization, or specifically if it's a financial institution, that may not be a big deal. Now, it would be a big deal in a financial institution, but depending on your organization, it may not be the biggest deal. Maybe you don't, you have them just work isolated or whatever you may put in place. Now, I'm not minimizing not conducting background checks or saying that you should always conduct background checks, but I was using it as an example that depending on the severity of the risk, the impact may not be so great. So, or let's say, for example, you and your own process for the Form I-9, Section 1 has to be completed no later than the first day of employment. Now, if you don't complete it until a week later, then that's a problem. That's real severity. And we'll get into Form I-9 process because that's our example we're going to walk through at the end later. But I hope that gave you a picture of how you determine inherent risk, the likelihood and the impact, basically without any controls in place.
Monét, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Actually, it's my question.
Okay.
But as you're talking, it occurred to me that, one of the things you are referring to is also taking a look at different things you might implement into your organization, such as a new payroll system.
Yeah.
At that point in time, is that also something that you look at and say, in order for us to determine if this is the right payroll system for our organization, we need to go through X amount of steps to make sure that we understand the inherent risk of adding this into our system and how it will affect other things? Is that also the idea?
Yes, you definitely should. And actually, under likelihood, when you're conducting an RCSA, you see here on this slide, change, the third bullet under likelihood. Change is related to just that, introducing new systems. If you know you're going to introduce a new system, then the likelihood most likely is increased because it's brand new. It'll be new to everyone who's working in that system. You don't know because you just know what maybe the salesperson told you about how the system will work. But I have been on the other side of system implementations that have been a mess and unintended, unknown impacts to all your daily BAU. We have to bring in more additional staff. Maybe it creates a backlog related to this system didn't work the way we intended or the way they said. In our old system, all we had to do was this, but now in this system, we had to do this and that. And no one knew about the second part, so everything went awry. No one got paid overtime or whatever the problem is or whatever situation is. But yes, introducing a new payroll process that is, or any process or system within HR, it's a good opportunity to go back to the RCSA. And you just also need to have someone who could be a part of the implementation process or maybe assessing the potential vendor or system and assessing for risk. What is your exposure? Because, and I won't get into third-party risk management and vendor risk management. I know for a fact we have one person on this webinar who is HR vendor management practitioner. And so she would be the better subject matter expert for that. But if your organization has third-party management office or vendor management services, they can help you with assessing that risk also. Step 3. So our first step was creating the risk inventory. The second step was assessing and determining inherent risk. And now step 3 is assessing effectiveness of the controls. So we just got from inherent risk. What is the risk without the controls in place? Now in step 3, we are actually assessing the controls that are in place. So effectiveness of controls is an estimate of the ability of existing controls to reduce the likelihood or limit the impact of a risk event. The rating scale in general, and you can have your own rating scale at your organization, is satisfactory, needs improvement, or unsatisfactory. When I assess the effectiveness of controls, I do a look back. Well, a look back and a look ahead, but a look back in terms of, has there been any control testing? Were there high error rates on that testing? Do we have a bunch of issues related to that process or that risk? or it's more specifically this control. So it's all aligned anyway, the process of risk control. But if we do a look back and see, we recently had some audit findings, we had some errors, we had a bunch of messed up stuff. We evaluate the control design, maybe the control when we're assessing the effectiveness of the control is not designed correctly. For an example, if you have a detective control for a specific risk, but you actually really should have a preventative control, then it's not really designed effectively. So, or you need to assess where the control fits in the actual process. So if all of your controls occur after the fact, for example, if for the payroll process, all of your controls happen after payroll has completely been submitted, meaning you push the button to pay employees and the pay is going out the door to everyone's bank accounts, then you start processing or enacting your internal controls. So then you look and say, okay, now let's do a review. Now let's do a validation and see that what they were supposed to get paid was what we paid. No, all that stuff should have happened before pay. I'm not saying that for payroll controls, you shouldn't have controls that are in place for after, I call it push the button, but after you push the button and pay employees, they should be both. But if all of your controls or just any one does not occur in the right place in a process, then your control design is not effective. So again, in assessing the effectiveness of controls, you review your history, how the control is designed, etc. And the final step is assess residual risk. So to repeat, we started with step 1, where we create the risk inventory of processes, risks, and controls. Step 2, we determine the inherent risk based on no controls being in place. Step 3, we assess the effectiveness of controls that are in place. And now step 4, we assess the residual risk. Residual risk is just what it sounds like. It's residual, it's left over. So residual risk is determined by evaluating the risk that remains after accounting for controls. And this is strictly, in my opinion, subjective. Now, companies may have a matrix, where they have low, medium, high is based on if the effectiveness of the control was rated as satisfactory, and then inherent risk was rated as certain or imminent. You can create that and do what you want at your organization, but it's just what I said. You create and develop the framework for how you will rate residual risk, just like how you will rate inherent risk or control effectiveness. So I say it's really subjective because it's however you decide, like if a high here and an imminent there equals a low here, or whatever the formula is. But to repeat, residual risk is just the risk that's left over after you account for the controls. And I do want to remind everyone, I may have walked through that. I don't know if that was too fast or too slow for everyone, but we'll also walk through an actual RCSA later. The next topic in learning objective is issue management. Issues in general are what they sound like. They're what they sound like in your personal life. The issue is a problem. Something typically you did not expect to happen. It causes angst and worry. It highlights a breakdown in your procedures, a gap, a control failure, or even the lack of controls. It's basically a deficiency, a malfunction. Every word you can throw at it, that is an issue. So in terms of issue management, we have an issue. Once we know there is an issue that has occurred, I know the first immediate response is, well, we need to fix it. We need to fix the problem. We need to remediate. We need to solve the problem, fix the problem. But sure, you may have put the Band-Aid on this one failure that occurred, or maybe 2 failures that occurred, but what's to stop it and prevent it from occurring again and again and again?
Like we talked about this week, I thought it was really important that we also make sure we don't send out emails to a lot of people that say cybersecurity breach or sincere issue. Look here. For documentation purposes. Can you speak on that? Because I know I run into that I've run into that at times, and it's not ideal.
So in terms of Diane's example, mass or broad communications, as I'm sure you all know from being HR practitioners, if you engage with legal counsel, almost everything is discoverable. So when she and I were speaking, I gave an example of RCSA testing being a good opportunity to assess your processes and your controls, because here's a good one. Let's say we think it's a good idea for all of the hiring panel or the interview panel to write down notes and their comments and their feedback about all the candidates that they interviewed. Now, that sounds like a good idea because it's like, oh, so we have all their feedback and their information and we can review and compile it, and then we'll make a decision on who to hire out of these 3 candidates. But many organizations get in trouble, specifically when there's a claim that's filed, that they look at those notes and scrutinize, and people have notes, whether it's harmless or whether they didn't intend for it to be harmful or nefarious or mean or discriminatory. It's just that they wrote it, or maybe they did intend to be discriminatory. So you may have notes like hair was too wild, or hair was too kinky, or whatever about someone's hair or some attribute. Or our clients or our customers won't like, doesn't meet or fit the demographic for our customers, or whatever language, or just so you get what I'm getting at, that sometimes writing things down is not always a good thing. There's always a trail. Now, obviously, I believe in documentation. Just by the nature of my work, things need to be documented, but we need to also, in our RCSA in general, and just your regular BAU and HR, assess your documentation, how you communicate, and it's good for you to either have a consultant or legal guidance on documentation in general. The documentation you create, your official business records, or your record retention and destruction policies. So we have issue management. As I said, issues are, you know what issues are. So once we identify an issue, like I said, the first response is typically, let's fix the problem, let's fix the issue. But you can't prevent it from occurring again if you don't get down to the root cause. Why did this issue occur? Why did this failure or breakdown or malfunction occur? And that is root cause analysis. It's basically getting to the heart of why. It helps answer the question of why the problem occurred, in order, and this is important, to identify appropriate solutions. Because if you think you know why the problem occurred and you implement a solution, but it actually doesn't get to the heart or the root cause of why the problem occurred, it's just going to keep happening because you didn't actually fix the actual, you didn't officially address the real root cause of the issue. So there's a method called the 5 whys. You don't have to practice it or implement it, but it's basically this. Once you identify the problem, you keep asking why, until you get down to the heart of the matter. So here's an example. The problem is I ran a red light and I got a ticket. But why did you run a red light? Because I was late for work. Why were you late for work? Because I woke up late. Why did you wake up late? My alarm clock didn't go off. Why didn't your alarm clock go off? The batteries were dead. Why were the batteries dead in your alarm clock? I forgot to replace. So this all stems from, you didn't replace those batteries when you're supposed to replace them. Now here we are with a $90 speeding ticket. So that's in general, that's a real world example. Hopefully not real world enough that we all get speeding tickets, but that's generally root cause analysis. So again, part of issues management, we identified the issue, we should be identifying the root cause, and now we need to develop an action plan or remediation plan, as some people call it. An action plan is a series of steps to remediate and or reduce the risk of an issue. The action plan should include even an evaluation of the existing employee impact to determine whether a look back is necessary. So some steps in an action plan you will see in general, no matter what the problem is: determine the complete impact or the full impacted employee population. I'm speaking as HR, so employee population or population. Once you identify the root cause, maybe you need to enhance your written procedures, SOPs, standard operating procedures. Maybe you need to update your policy. Maybe you need to add more training or retrain the staff who may have had to perform the human error. Maybe you need to implement a control or a bunch of controls related to validating data or secondary reviews. So Diane enters the bank account information for employee pay or whatever, and then I review to ensure that the bank account information she entered is accurate based on we call it golden source, based on the golden source document. So again, action plan should include a whole bunch of components. The full impacted population, whatever internal controls you need to enhance or implement. But the key part I want to focus on in this section is determining whether a look back is necessary. So this is important to me, and I should be important to all of you as HR practitioners, is because just because you found out today that, oh, we have a couple of people we found out, we never conducted the background check for them, or we have terminated employees that we never sent a COBRA notice to. So you may just think, oh, so now that we know, we're going to go, whether you have a vendor or your benefits department does it themselves, then you're going to compile the COBRA notice, then send out the COBRA information to that terminated or departing or offboarded employee. But that's just those two people you found out about. You need to do a look back to see. And a good look back, I'm not going to tell you to go look back. Let's look over the last 10 years to see if we did it correctly. In general, I would say, like right now, we're in November, the middle of November. So we found out we had some issues or problems. Even though we're almost in the 12th month of the year, I would say go back to January 1st, look at all terminated employees, and I don't care how many terminated employees there are, and ensure or at least validate that they received the COBRA notices when they were supposed to receive it. And even if they didn't, you got to figure out a way to remediate. And then, so that's the importance. I hope that gave you an indication of the importance of the look back, because you want to ensure that the full impacted population, whether they're active employees or terminated employees, that you address and remediate the issue. And then finally, every action plan, and this is a step in an action plan that a lot of people forget to include, because sometimes managing an issue from beginning to end could take a year or more. It's not, many times it doesn't just take a month or 3 months or 6 months to remediate. There are multiple steps, and depending on what else is going on in your organization or what all it entails, what the action plan entails, it may take up to a year or more. So having said that, the plan should clearly state how you will evidence that the action has been completed. I've encountered this in my career when I look at an action plan that I didn't develop, or the people around me, maybe they weren't involved. So let's say it was action plan was effective like 9 months ago. And maybe there was some attrition. People have come and gone out the department, but here we are today. You're responsible for, completing this action plan or ensuring this action plan was completed. So you look at the wording and say, well, it says this, but what does that mean? How will we prove that happened? No one has any idea how to show, I don't know how to show they did this, or based on the wording. And this is serious, that some action plans are not written, well, many aren't written very, very well at all. So that's why I say to add the last part of an action plan, just a nice bullet or two that shows how you will evidence. And it could simply state the evidence. So let's say you indicate, conduct a legal review or consult with legal to review the FMLA policies, yada, yada, add X amount of controls and test the controls on a monthly basis. So your evidence would include perhaps the actual written legal assessment or review, or maybe even meeting invites showing that the meetings occurred with legal. So you can write that down, like that's the evidence you're going to look at. In terms of implementing or enhancing controls, what was the control before the language and what is the new control language? Or if there was no control, what is the new control? And then the last part where perhaps it mentioned testing those controls, like especially if the action plan is supposed to take a year to complete, test the controls at least 3 times, before we close this issue or this action plan. So you need to show the evidence that you actually perform a test. And then finally, that's what everything I just said over the last 10 minutes or so is what sums up an issue management. Issues management is identifying the issue, identifying the root cause, true root cause, developing an action plan to completion. Testing plans. This is the third learning objective for this session. And I'll tie this all together if you're wondering how this all fits into RCSA. RCSA is a long-term process. Issues management, issues usually come out of or identified as a result of the RCSA. And many times when you have an issue, you should implement testing. But even if you don't have issues, when you have internal controls in place, how do you know that the controls are operating effectively? Sure, assessing the effectiveness of controls is part of the RCSA, but in a regular cadence, you truly assess control and evaluate controls by testing them. And what does testing look like? Testing is basically a tool used to evaluate whether controls are designed and operating effectively. There are various testing techniques, but the main one I'll focus on is inspection or examination. We have sample selection, meaning determining how you will select your sample. Sample size, determining the sample size of population. Testing frequency and testing steps. So for testing plans, as I said, one of the most common testing techniques is inspection or examination. This is basically reviewing document. I won't say that all examination is related to documentation, but in general, it's documentation, documentation, documentation. So this testing plan, that's inspection or examination, is basically the review of documentation associated with executing the control. Examples include a checklist. So let's say there's a checklist, and I'll keep using the example of payroll. Let's say there's a payroll checklist. The checklist includes all the various steps in processing payroll on a bi-weekly, weekly, and monthly basis. That checklist may have sign-offs, like maybe the payroll coordinator initials or signs off that they completed all these steps. Maybe it shows who performed the QA or the quality assurance review of the completion of that step. And then finally, the entire checklist may or may not include sign off by the payroll manager or the head of payroll. So if you're testing a control, again, examples of inspection for documentation may be a checklist, and maybe the reconciliation, showing you generating whatever data or information specific to finance or payroll, but then what was the reconciliation? So showing how you reconcile the data. Sign-offs or approvals. A good one for compensation would be, or even talent acquisition or hiring. So approval documentation for TA with an offer would be, let's say, any offer, and I'm just going to throw a number out there, any offer to executive director or above requires the approval of, let's say, the unit's senior vice president. So if that's a process or step you have in place, then you need to see their approvals. So these 3 executive directors were hired. Where is the sign off or email confirmation or whatever you use related to that approval? Random sampling is the most common sample selection methodology. Again, we're talking about testing. So we know we need to test these controls and to test the effectiveness of these controls. So we're performing an inspection of the control, basically the documentation. So how do we get our sample? Typically, we will use random sampling. The sample comes from the larger population. So you can't just say, I'm going to choose 15 people. Where do those 15 people come from? You need to know what your total population is before you even determine what your sample size is. For example, for random sampling, let's say we use the example of, I'll keep going back to background checks. So we want to ensure that background checks were completed when they were supposed to be completed, how they were supposed to be completed, meaning the specific background checks. Let's say for MVRs, motor vehicle records, for drivers, if you have drivers at your, whatever your company is. So we need to ensure that we have that background check for drivers specifically. Let's say we also need to have drug test requirements. So if we're testing that those controls are effective in ensuring that the background checks are completed, if we're looking back and we say, we hire about 50 people a year, I would say maybe this is, and we hire weekly, or we perform these background checks weekly, whatever, for this population. I would say maybe you need to perform this test, and I always go overboard. So I would say you need to perform this testing probably monthly, honestly, even for a population of 50 people. Perform it monthly just to ensure that, especially if compliance with DOT, Department of Transportation regulations and guidance as it relates to background checks for drivers. But so I'm getting at population. You need to determine if you have 50 people who are new hires this past year, the full population is 50. Your sample size should probably be, for that rate, you probably only need to do like 10 people. But again, this is subjective. Whatever you decide at your organization is how you decide you're going to create your testing mechanism or testing governance. You determine the sample size, you determine the testing frequency, you determine the testing steps. But for this sample size, like I said, maybe 5 people, testing frequency is typically based on auditing standards. Many times the testing frequency for controls is 12 months or even 3 years, which hardly anyone does 3-year intervals of testing. Most people perform testing monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. So again, it's based on auditing standards or your organization's risk framework. And this will become more clear as we get to the example at the end. And finally, outline the testing steps. So we have our testing technique, which is the inspection or examination. We have the full population. We provided a random sample from the full population. We have our sample size. We know the testing frequency. We're going to test monthly. And now we're going to outline the testing steps. So perhaps for background checks, we would, step 1, request the list of all new hires over whatever period. Randomly select 10 new hires. Obtain the background check report from the vendor. Now, again, based on privacy or whatever policies you may have in place, maybe your tester won't be able to look, maybe they won't be able to completely look at and review the background check report, but there should be some kind of confirmation or indication that the background checks were completed. So obtain background check status report, whatever you want to call it, for that sample size. Look at the start date. So compare the start date to the background check completion date. If they started on May 1st, but the background check wasn't completed, meaning they started working on May 1st, but the background check wasn't completed until May 25th, that may be a problem, or most likely is a problem, specifically if your process includes ensuring that background checks must be completed prior to start date. So using that general overview of testing steps, I would say that if we have people in this population that completed their background check well after their start date, then those are errors or basically failures. So use an example of 10 people in your sample size. If 2 or 3 out of the 10, I'll just say 3. If 3 out of the 10 employees started work before the background check was complete, that's a 30% error rate. That is a big failure, and that's a big red alert that your controls are not operating effectively. RCSA walkthrough. Now, I know I've given you all a lot of information, and your eyes may be glazing over at this point, but I do want to go through this RCSA walkthrough so you can see the RCSA in practice live and in color. So I'm going to start with a regulation. Immigration Reform and Control Act. Some people may not have ever heard of that act, IRCA, but we all should know it if we're employers as Form I-9, the Form I-9 compliance. This is how the Form I-9 came into practice through IRCA. And related to IRCA, all US employers are required to verify the identity and employment authorization of the employees hired to work after November 9, 1986. That's when it went into effect. To implement the law, employers are required to complete the Employment Eligibility Verification Form, also known as the Form I-9, for all employees, including US citizens. I highlighted including US citizens because many people think that they only need to complete a Form I-9. Well, people think a lot of things, but they think you only need to complete a Form I-9 for people who are not US citizens, non-US citizens. Or they even think, I don't need to complete a Form I-9, or I can't hire people who aren't US citizens. So that's another thinking that people have, which is a violation of immigration law. So we have the regulation that we must comply with. What happens if we violate this law? So we have civil penalties, civil fines, criminal penalties, etc. That is the risk we're exposed to. $230 all the way up to $22,972 per individual. Penalties and fines for violating Form I-9 guidance and not complying with Form I-9 guidance are very, very heavy. These two bullets highlight the failure to comply with the Form I-9 instructions. These could be technical violations, or the second bullet, which is more nefarious in my opinion, hiring or continuing to employ a person that is not authorized to work in the US. Here are some examples, so we need to be aware. Abercrombie and Fitch had two different, that we know of, two different penalties assessed and fines assessed based on their I-9 violations. The first one in 2010 was well over $1 million, and those were related to technology-related deficiencies. They use an electronic verification system, but the system still caused errors or wasn't appropriately configured. It wasn't operating correctly in compliance with the law. The second time they violated the law was in 2015. Well, they violated before then, but they were fined in 2015. They were required to pay over $157,000 to the complainant, and they had to create a back pay fund for individuals who may have also been harmed. This particular violation involved requesting a specific document from the employee. That's an I-9 violation. You cannot ask or tell the employee which documents to provide to complete the I-9. So for this example, the company Abercrombie and Fitch, the person was not a US citizen. So they specifically asked them to show and provide their green card, or the official name, permanent resident card, to complete the I-9. That's a violation because they have other options and document options that they can provide. They don't have to provide their permanent resident card.
Monét,
Yes.
I often have a client who will tell me that they need to request driver's license because that individual is going to drive for the organization.
Oh, yes, that makes sense. Yes, that makes sense. The driver's license, and as I use in another example, it's part of the motor vehicle record. So anytime you have drivers, and I don't want to make a blanket statement, but in general, whenever you have drivers who are driving for your company in the operation of their work as part of their job to drive, you better have, you better know that they have a valid, accurate, current, whatever driver's license. You better be performing their motor vehicle record check at least annually, whatever cadence you want to as your organization, but at least annually. So yes, that's perfectly fine. No, but if your question was related to them having drivers specifically use the driver's license for the I-9, then no, that's a violation. If you want the driver's license from the drivers, that needs to be part of their just background check related to driving. That has nothing to do with, oh, they're completing I-9, so I'll just make them give me. No, they can provide a passport or they can provide some other document. So yes, that's a violation. I know it seems easier. A lot of times we like to think, oh, we'll just kill two birds with one stone. No, you're violating the law.
Perfect, thanks.
So Form I-9 compliance, and again, we're about to walk through this RCSA. I'm setting up the stage for, this is the regulation, IRCA, we must comply with, and we have to operationalize. These are the main sections or areas of Form I-9 compliance, and they also typically get people in trouble. Completing Section 1, Section 2, reviewing the documents, remote workers, and I added COVID-19 DHS guidance. As all of you should know, during this period of the COVID-19 pandemic, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, allowed employers to review original documents either electronically, over Zoom, whatever. Basically, they didn't have to, the law actually requires us to physically look at the documents, meaning the passport, birth certificate, social security card, whatever. But during COVID, because most companies were remote, or many companies were remote, DHS has allowed us to just accept copies of the document or review it some other way. However, with the caveat that once the business returns to normal operations, then you have 3 days to then review the original documents for all those people you hired using the COVID way. But anyway, so section 3, re-verifying employment eligibility for non-US citizens or aliens authorized to work. And finally, document retention. People get in trouble all the time for document retention. They don't retain the I-9s long enough, or they throw them out immediately and they have no documents. They haven't been retained for the required guidelines. So here's the Form I-9 process, the employment eligibility verification process for RCSA. And this is going to be quick and dirty only because, like I said, this could take a long time, but I just wanted to highlight and hope we get a snapshot and capture walking through this RCSA. So my first process up is Form I-9 process. Going back to what we learned about 30 minutes ago, we create the risk inventory. So the risk related to the Form I-9 process can include hiring someone not authorized to work, failure to complete the Form I-9 for all employees, record retention violations, etc. Here's an example of a risk statement that may be relevant. Failure to verify the employment eligibility of all employees due to lack of vendor oversight, and I had 2 asterisks there, leading to regulatory violations and penalties and fines causing financial loss and reputational damage. And I have those 2 asterisks there because many people, since we're talking about Form I-9, many companies believe that just because you use a third party to administer and handle your Form I-9, they think there's no risk, that the liability is on the vendor. No, it's you. You are the employer. I don't care how much you pay that vendor or how popular that vendor is or how many companies use that vendor to complete, for the employees to complete the electronic I-9. It's on you. If there are errors, if I-9s aren't complete, if they're completed incorrectly, if employees are not re-verified, that's all on you, the employer. So that is a good risk, because I've seen it before. People depend on vendors too much and gets them in trouble.
Monét,
Yes.
I have another question.
Yeah.
It is a question on our chat. It says, can I require valid driver's license for employees that drive their own vehicles for work? I'm HR at a museum and employees travel to schools, libraries, etc. to do outreach programs.
Now, that's actually a tricky one. So I hate to sound like a HR person, but I would say that the person asking this question, that they actually seek their own legal guidance or their counsel at their company. Because I would, if it is a requirement of work, meaning they're not a driver, they're not a bus driver, they don't drive vehicles, they're not a trucker or that type of thing, meaning the essential function of the job is to drive. But if it's expected, so that's one thing. So if it's expected, like in this example, for them to drive, like, oh, they have to visit sites, or they have to do this, or they go and have meetings all over the place and we expect them to have a license. Like, I'm sure you've seen ads, job posting that say, must have a valid driver's license, but it's not a driver. So I would say, so I actually don't really want to answer, that you seek legal guidance for your own company requirements.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sure that person's not thanking me, but that's the best I can give. I don't want to give that guidance. So anyway, so for the Form I-9 process RCSA, we have our risk inventory. I read the risk statement, and then internal controls. And I have this on here, and this is intentional. The current internal controls we have in place for the I-9 process is we conduct annual training. That's it. And training could be an internal control. It's a directive control. So inherent risks, remember, that's the second step in the RCSA process. So I have assessed the inherent risk. Likelihood of a risk event is certain, imminent, due to the volume. Let's say we hire thousands of people. That's a high volume. And all these thousands of people must have a Form I-9 completed. There's a history of problems. The company is changing I-9 vendors this year. The complexity of process, it is complicated. It's a simple, smaller, well, now it's like 2 pages, but it's a 2-page form, but it gets a lot of companies in trouble. And when I say trouble, they may not have been inspected and then had fines and penalties assessed, but it's just that just in everyday work, I know from speaking to other HR practitioners, Form I-9 compliance is like top 5 worry at their organization because people just don't know how to do it. We don't. So again, I assess the inherent risk as likelihood is certain imminent. The impact is critical because of the undue detriment to employees, the potential fines exceed risk event threshold. So that was my assessment of inherent risk, that the likelihood is certain and imminent due to all those things. So now I'm going to assess the effectiveness of the controls. Now, as you see in a risk inventory, I only have one control, which is annual training. And I think that's enough. I say, oh, we train our employees, the people who complete the Form I-9 for us in HR, we train them every year. They go to this training. Or we give them a new guidebook or manual. So this assessment of the effectiveness of controls is unsatisfactory. That's the lowest ranking. Earlier this month, internal audit found that out of 435 employees out of 1,525 new hires in the past year did not have a Form I-9 on file. We also failed an inspection. This led to $75,000 in fines for various violations. The front desk staff completing a Form I-9 actually never received their training. The controls are inadequate to mitigate the risk. So my rating for effectiveness of controls is unsatisfactory. Go ahead.
I find that to be one of the number one things that I find in doing compliance audits for organizations is the I-9. The lack of completion of just the date on the I-9 form that's within that body always seems to be empty.
Exactly. I don't know what people's problem is with dates. Some people just don't like to put a date next to their signature. I don't know why that is, but I've seen that a lot where the Form I-9 is not dated, section 1. So residual risk, remember, this is step 4. Simply, I've assessed the residual risk as high. It's still high, even with those controls, because there's only one control and they're obviously not effective. So this is where we tie in the RCSA, issues management, and testing. So we just completed, it was quick and dirty, but you got the point, the RCSA for the specific Form I-9 process. Now, because we have the effectiveness of controls is unsatisfactory, we could dig into that and see these are the gaps, these are the breakdowns in the controls, this is the problem or the issue. Now we lead into issue management. So we develop an action or remediation plan to resolve these issues that we discovered because we performed this RCSA. And again, repeating some of the things we discovered: ineffective controls, just the process in general. I could just use the blanket statement: the controls are not effective, they're inadequate, there aren't enough controls, need to enhance them, etc. So again, we identified the issues, process gaps, and so we need to enhance internal controls. The testing plan: we'll do an examination. Because this is a weekly control, we hire people on a weekly basis. So we need to complete this Form I-9 on a weekly basis, ensure that the I-9 is being completed. Section 1 by the first day of employment, Section 2 within 3 days of the first day of employment. Sample size is 12. I just threw that out there with my own governance or framework. Sample size is 12. It's a monthly test and the testing steps. So I'm going to repeat that testing plan and elaborate on that. So this is a weekly control, as I said. It's a weekly control, but because of the history of problems, and that's big, that 435 employees out of 1,524 did not even have an I-9 completed, that's a big deal. So this control needs to be tested monthly. As such, the sample size we determined is 12 based on the number of people we may hire. Testing steps include obtaining a list of all new hires over the past month. Sample size, randomly select 12 new hires. Review whether you have the access to your electronic I-9 system or whether you still have I won't say still, whether you use paper Form I-9s, but somehow you need to obtain the Form I-9s, or as I said with the other example, that because of some privacy policies you may have at your organization, maybe the tester should not be privy to the information that is included on the I-9, meaning your social security number, date of birth, citizenship status, all that. But instead, let's say there is a validated source that can show when Section 1 was completed, when Section 2 was completed, the documentation that was used to complete it, and then if this person, so Section 3 doesn't count, but yeah, so those are the steps. Get the population, the random sample, obtain the dates of when Section 1 and Section 2 was completed, and the documents used to complete Section 2. Then the test basically is the comparison. Compare the date Section 1 was completed with the date of hire. So to remind everyone, the guidelines are Section 1 has to be completed by the first day of employment. So if we started on June 1st, but you didn't complete Section 2 until June 5th, then already that's an error. It wasn't completed on time. Section 2 has to be completed within 3 days of hire. If you started on June 1st, but you didn't complete Section 2 until June 15th or June 20th, another error. So that's a fail right there. And then you just go from there. You work your list, and again, with the subjectivity, your organization should select and develop what framework you have for your testing plan, meaning how you will rate your error rates. Let's say 10% error rate, your organization doesn't think that's a big deal. But some people may have a lower threshold and say, if we have a 5% error rate on these tests, that's a fail, and we need to open an issue and action plan to remediate. Now, as I said, that was quick and dirty. I hope that was a good enough run through so everyone could understand in general, your RCSA. And I want to highlight again, because I think it's highly important. I've seen it, I can't repeat it enough, at multiple organizations. Using a third-party vendor, not even just for Form I-9, but for any service. As we're in the HR business, we use vendors. We have benefits vendors, we have benefits providers, we have leave administration, we have everything under the sun. We may even use payroll vendors. Some people use recruiting firms, whatever. So if you have a vendor, that does not absolve you of risk and liability.
We did have one more question.
Yes.
And the question was, and I know we're right up against the time. It is, don't all large financial institutions use E-Verify, thereby taking the liability away from the company for that?
No. So a lot of people think that quite a few companies have gotten into trouble because they think that E-Verify itself is the Form I-9. It's not. The Form I-9, and if you're basically federal contract, if you are obligated to go through E-Verify, are two different things. So to answer that question, no. Pushing your employee or putting the new hires through E-Verify system, that has nothing to do with, I won't say it does nothing. It's related to the Form I-9, but it does not replace Form I-9 compliance and having a complete Form I-9 on file for your employees. Does that answer the question?
I believe it does. Let me see if I get any chat back. Adriana, feel free to go ahead and talk. Take yourself off of mute. I think we all can.
So my question was not asking about the replacement of it, but when you complete an I-9 and then follow up doing E-Verify, I would think with larger institutions that they have that in place as part of the background check, and it reduces the liability on the company if you're going through the E-Verify process.
Now, there may be some truth to that, reducing the liability, but again, I know you said you didn't ask about the replacement. I still want to express that they still are two separate things. So E-Verify may indicate that this person is legally authorized or whatever, but you still do need the Form I-9. So to recap, I hope over this time frame, you have come away with some ability to analyze operational risks and identify and make recommendations for process of control changes, that you know how to at least start developing testing plans to test internal controls, And finally, that you know how to manage issues, meaning you identify the issue, identify the root cause, develop remediation and action plans, and you follow it through to completion.
Let me break for 1 second. Emma, I'm getting questions with regards to the SHRM credits. Would you please put up the SHRM and/or HRCI codes that would be relevant for today's presentation so that we can allow Monét to go on after that? It's
Yes,
been a great
they're
program.
coming
Monét.
right now. Thank you.
And I do want to close this presentation just by thanking everyone for attending today. And I just repeat, since it's Veterans Day, the best thing we can all do as HR professionals is today is the day where people say, thank a vet. Well, people over the past few years have now been saying, to thank a vet, hire a vet. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
This was terrific, Monét. I really, really enjoyed it. You did not let me down.
I'm looking at the time and I'm like, oh, I think I'm going to live for too long, but.
But this information is so difficult. You know, it's really important that we get it right because it means a lot of money when in fact we don't get it right. But more importantly, it puts our organization at risk, which ultimately puts our employees at risk. And I don't know about everybody else, but I think we all like working right now. So it's important.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Can we make your presentation available to attendees today?
Yes, that's fine. Yes.
Great. Do you want to give any of your contact information in case somebody has a question? Of course, everybody again knows me, Diane Campanelli. I do provide some compliance support for organizations. I look to Monét, I have to tell you, for some of my information. So if you're comfortable sharing.
If I can ask, Diane, I was wondering if I can ask one more question.
Sure.
So, first of all, Monét, that was a wonderful presentation. Similar to Diane, I am attending an online master's program for a master's in employment law, risk and compliance. So I've already taken 2 compliance courses. I'm currently attending 1. So you've just confirmed everything that I'm learning. This second compliance class is called compliance failures. So following up with when there are failures. But my question is, for somebody in a compliance role at a larger institution, because obviously compliance is more targeted towards healthcare as well as financial institutions. What does a day in the life look like for the average HR compliance specialist at a bank?
So I will tell you this, and I don't want to paint a negative picture because I want everyone to do HR risk and compliance. And I love my work, so that's why I can be excited about it. But every day you are uncovering your job, you are uncovering problems and issues. Or if you're not specifically uncovering through testing or the RCSA process or risk assessment, the problems come to you, as you know, which is the function of your job. People come to you and say, oh, we had a payroll problem or a payroll error. Oh, we just found this thing out, or we just found this other problem out. So the day in a life, it is varied. Every day, my everyday work, whether currently at JPMorgan Chase or any previous employer working on HR risk and compliance, it varied. It was different from day to day. Dealing with every HR function. It could be benefits, could take up a lot of your time today. The next day it could be recruiting or talent acquisition. The next day it could be related to systems, access, HRIS matters, or it could be payroll, compensation, equity, whatever. It could be the severance process or performance management, where people are getting, well, managers may be getting into problems where they're not applying consistently policy to their employees and how they manage their performance, et cetera. So you are never bored, I must honestly say. It's a lot of reading and a lot of work, but I enjoy it and I think it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome.
With your credit codes, oh, excuse me, Diane, yeah. I can't seem to find them. We will get them to you this afternoon or tomorrow morning, anyone who was on today, so my apologies. And if you don't get them for some reason, you don't get the email from me, feel free to just shoot an email at info@delaware or info@deshRM.org sherm.org. So, and we will get those out to you. Thanks for being flexible.
Thank you.
Thanks,
And
Monét.
I did include my email in the chat.
Thank you so much, Monét. Diane, anything else to add?
Nope, make sure that you pay attention to some of the emails that you get from Delaware SHRM, because we're looking forward to a really fun first quarter as well. And Moné's going to join us on a regular basis, I got a feeling. So we can ask her lots of questions. But
Exactly.
thank you so much for joining us today. Nice to see everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.